This is episode 68 of That Shakespeare Life.
Hi, I'm David Kathman, independent scholar and owner of the Shakespeare authorship website. Another great method for studying the life of William Shakespeare includes listening to this. It's That Shakespeare Life with my friend Cassidy Cash.
Yes, drama then as today was a collaborative art form. It's interesting that we have records from Philip Henslow's diary, the owner of the Rose Theatre, and he almost invariably is paying 2, 3, 4, 5, even 6 playwrights when he buys a play script.
Welcome to That Shakespeare Life with Cassidy Cash. Cassidy believes that if you desire to successfully learn or perform Shakespeare's plays, then understanding the real life and history of William Shakespeare himself is a must. That Shakespeare Life is the podcast that helps you go beyond the curtain of some of Shakespeare's most iconic works and explore the world of early modern England as Shakespeare would have lived it, learning from the writers, historians, and performers who know it best. And now, here's Cassidy.
While Shakespeare's name is the most well-known of the playwrights from Renaissance England, he was hardly the only famous artist working during that time period. Christopher Marlowe, Ben Jonson, John Fletcher, and John Lyly are just a few of the names we can mention of excellent theater practitioners working alongside the bard. And it turns out William Shakespeare apparently had at least a high professional respect for these gentlemen personally, as he's known to have collaborated with several of them on plays like Pericles, Henry VIII, and Timon of Athens. But knowing that Shakespeare collaborated with fellow playwrights, even with members of rival playing companies, brings up some questions about the practicality of collaborating in the Renaissance. Who owned the plays that they wrote? Why weren't the collaborative plays published with all of the contributing authors? There are so many questions about what collaboration actually looked like for William Shakespeare, and this week we have the man who literally wrote the book on Shakespeare's collaborative works, Dr. Erik Rasmussen, here to walk us through 16th century playhouses and the world of collaborative Renaissance theater. Erik Rasmussen is an award-winning author, editor, and scholar. He has been called the Robert Langdon of the Shakespeare world by the Washington Post. Stories about his recent authentication of a newly discovered Shakespeare First Folio featured in the New York Times, USA Today, The Guardian, NPR, CNN, and the BBC, among many others. Rasmussen's narrative account of the Shakespeare thefts in search of the First Folios was serialized by the London Sunday Times and Australia's national newspaper. He has co-edited the Royal Shakespeare Company's collaborative plays by William Shakespeare and others with Jonathan Bate, which was the winner of the Falstaff Award for 2013 Best Book of the Year, along with the Shakespeare First Folios, a descriptive catalog, and the Royal Shakespeare Company's complete works of William Shakespeare. Rasmussen is the co-editor of the Norton Anthology of English Renaissance Drama, as well as critical editions for the Arden Shakespeare, Oxford's World's Classics, the Revels Plays, and the Malone Society. He's a contributor to the Cambridge edition of the works of Ben Jonson and Shakespeare Beyond Doubt. Rasmussen has served on the board of trustees of the Shakespeare Association of America and is currently Foundation Professor of English at the University of Nevada. Hello, Erik. Welcome to the show.
Hi, Cassidy. Pleasure to be here.
What are the plays that are included when we say Shakespeare Apocrypha?
Well, weird term, isn't it? Because Apocrypha is usually used to texts that are excluded from the biblical canon. And in 1909, Oxford University Press gathered together the plays that had been attributed to Shakespeare. They're not in the First Folio, but some even in his lifetime. Plays like Pericles, The London Prodigal, Thomas Lord Cromwell, The Puritan Widow, A Yorkshire Tragedy, and Locrine all had William Shakespeare on the title pages of the printed quartos. And then over the years, a number of plays have just felt Shakespearean, or parts of them have felt Shakespearean. So things like Arden of Feversham and Edward III. For Thomas More, there's a manuscript play that some parts feel Shakespearean to people. And these are generally known to get collectively as the Shakespeare Apocrypha, because they weren't part of that original First Folio. And then some have been accepted into the canon, like Pericles and the Two Noble Kinsmen. Many others have not.
Was it a common practice for playwrights in the 16th century to collaborate on plays? Was this feeling Shakespeare? Is that because he was working on them or because those writers were influenced by him?
Yes, drama then as today was a collaborative art form. It's interesting that we have records from Philip Henslow's diary, the owner of the Rose Theatre, and he almost invariably is paying 2, 3, 4, 5, even 6 playwrights when he buys a play script. In fact, Brian Bickers has recently argued that no known playwright in the period did not collaborate. So there's evidence that every one of them worked with somebody else on a play. I think that needs to be revised a tiny bit. I don't think John Lyly ever collaborated with anybody. He's the only one of dozens and dozens and dozens of professional playwrights who didn't at some point work with another dramatist.
Which playwrights did Shakespeare work with most often?
In the beginning of his career, I mean, it's an interesting trajectory because it looks like when he was a fledgling playwright, first came to London, he would work with other playwrights. It looked like he worked with Keele, Titus Andronicus early on, and that he contributed some scenes to a play called Edward III and the Arden of Feversham. And then later in his career, he collaborated with Thomas Middleton on Timon of Athens, with George Wilkins on Pericles. And then later in his career, he collaborated a lot with John Fletcher. So in answer to your question, probably most often, it looks like he collaborated with Fletcher on The Two Noble Kinsmen, a lost play, Cardenio, maybe Henry VIII. And it seems there he was passing the baton to Fletcher, who would become the chief playwright for The King's Men. There are clusters at the beginning of his career and at the end of his career, and occasionally in between.
Now, you alluded to this by saying there's evidence that he worked with this person or that person. And certainly when you were outlining the Apocrypha, you're saying it feels Shakespearean. But what is the evidence? I suppose it's textual evidence, but you mentioned Henslow's diary, so it might be something else. But what is the evidence that tells us Shakespeare was not like John Lyly in writing all by himself? Why do we think Shakespeare wasn't the sole author of some of his plays?
For centuries, readers and theater goers have noticed inconsistencies in some of the plays, and they can be stylistic inconsistencies, little loose ends. And so people have often speculated, well, I wonder if there was, he was working with somebody else here. But with the advent of computers and sort of literary corpora, you can now do linguistic, stylistic fingerprinting. And basically what this says is that every author, every one of us, has idiosyncrasies that we use. There are phrases we use, there are words that we use, that you could then, if you knew everyone's stylistic fingerprint, you could create a computer program that would analyze a piece of work and say, yes, this scene is this particular playwright, this is playwright. And fascinatingly, Don Foster, who was at the forefront of this work, created a computer program that he said could identify unknown Renaissance authors. And he sent it to a university press, and the university press sent out to an anonymous reader. And the anonymous reader said, this is garbage. You can't possibly do this just based on linguistic evidence. And so he rejected the book manuscript. Don Foster then took the rejection letter from the anonymous reviewer, ran it through his computer program, figured out who it was, wrote to this scholar and said, I think you can.
No way.
And so and also he then used, there was a novel called Primary Colors about the Clinton campaign that was published anonymously. And Don Foster ran it through his computer program and figured out that it was Joe Klein, the Newsday columnist. And then Joe Klein had to come out and say, yes, it was me. And one of the things that was identifying was the collocation tarmac hopping, which was used in the book for presidential candidates on the campaign trail. And only Joe Klein had ever used that combination before. So people are now able to do this and to sort of parse out little pieces of plays and say, well, this is much more like Marlowe than Shakespeare. And in fact, the Oxford Shakespeare editors have recently argued that Christopher Marlowe and Shakespeare collaborated on some of the early Henry VI plays. So it's a really interesting time to be part of, thinking about authorship and collaboration and attribution as these computer programs get more and more sophisticated.
So why are some of Shakespeare's collaborative plays then not talked about in terms of partnerships? I think of Rodgers and Hammerstein, for example. Why is Henry VIII not known as this play is by Shakespeare and Fletcher? Why did Fletcher get dropped off of that?
Yeah, I think it goes back to the Renaissance. There was clearly a prejudice against collaborative plays. So
even though it was industry standard practice.
Even though so for instance, when Ben Jonson published his folio of plays, he left out quite a number of things that we know plays that we know he collaborated on. And plays like Eastward Ho! And The Isle of Dogs. And it's fascinating that he even says for the play Sejanus, well, there was another author who worked with me on this, but I'd taken out all of his stuff. So that his collection was only single authored plays. And it seems likely that the Shakespeare First Folio, they were also saying, we know he worked with Pericles. We know he worked with Fletcher on The Two Noble Kinsmen, but we're going to deliberately leave these out because we only want things that are pretty much single authored. And then the same thing happened with John Marston's plays when they were published in 1633. The publisher left out all of his known collaborations. And so that this clearly, there's this feeling that those are adulterated or those are lesser or those are different. And it's gone on through the ages. In fact, the reason that these plays are apocrypha in Kirkwood is often because people didn't want to let them into the canon because they had there was another authorial voice in that.
So when we pick up a copy of Shakespeare's complete works, are we looking at a set of plays that he wrote mostly himself, under the acknowledgement that there are things like Pericles and Henry VIII that Shakespeare was an author on, but he wasn't the sole author? So is that the kind of delineation there you're making between folio plays and other things that Shakespeare did? It's not actually Shakespeare's complete works because there are other ones that he worked on.
Right. I think we do ourselves a disservice when we say, you have to have a certain percentage of authorship to be included in the canon. Jonathan Bate and I recently published a collection called William Shakespeare and Others, the collaborative plays. What's fascinating about the collaborative plays is in something like Edward III, which he may have written maybe when the first came to London in the late 1580s. It looks like he wrote the Countess scenes, and the Countess is a very strong female character. And a play called Arden of Feversham, it also looks like he wrote the scenes for Alice, who is this strong woman who murders her husband. And I rather love it that there's this new kid in town and he can write strong women. And so other playwrights are going to him when they need a strong female character. And my gosh, isn't this amazing as sort of a precursor to Lady Macbeth and Cleopatra and Portia? So when you want to understand Shakespeare and his trajectory, you have to include these, even if there's just a couple of scenes that Shakespeare may have contributed.
So explain to us what the process would have looked like to collaborate with one another. Did the fact that these writers collaborated with each other, does that necessarily mean that they were working in close proximity, like part of the same company?
Yeah, the irony is that when Renaissance playwrights work together, it looks like they always worked apart. So there's this famous case where Thomas Nash and Ben Jonson wrote a play called The Isle of Dogs, which was very scandalous and got them thrown into prison. And Nash complains that Thomas Nash, only wrote the first act, and Ben Jonson wrote the final 4 acts. And Nash says he did not have the least guess of my drift or scope. And when Shakespeare and Fletcher were collaborating on The Two Noble Kinsmen, it looks like they were using different sources. So Shakespeare was using Norse Plutarch, and the character Pericles is trisyllabic in Shakespeare's section and is spelled Pirithous, which is the Norse Plutarch. But Fletcher was using Chaucer. And Chaucer, the name has 4 syllables, and it's spelled Pirithous, Perithous. But Shakespeare, the same thing happens with Middleton in Timon of Athens. Shakespeare has Apemantus and Ventidius, but Middleton has Apermantus and Ventigius. And then when Shakespeare was working on the Sir Thomas More play, which was originally written by Anthony Mundy, and then 3 or 4 different play doctors were brought in to sort of punch it up for various reasons, it looks like Shakespeare didn't even know the names of the characters. because when he's writing a speech for Sir Thomas More and has other characters interject, he just writes the speech prefix other every time it appears. So this is, about as separate and distinct as you can possibly be, assuming that somebody will fill in the names of your characters later on.
So who owned the production rights of the final work then in the 16th century? You mentioned Henslowe had to pay up to 6 people for the rights to perform a play. Would there have been conflicts of interest when working with a writer from another company? How did they were obviously kind of tenacious relationship. How did they navigate this in terms of who got to perform the final piece?
Yeah, it's tricky. I mean, there are some playwrights who had an association with a particular company, but some who were sort of freelance. And it looks like Middleton was one of these, presumably, because the company would ultimately own the rights to the play, both performance and publication. They would pay the playwright. It looks like in Shakespeare's case, because he was a sharer with the King's Men, he was much more vested with them. Presumably Middleton they would pay him for his play and send him on his way, which is pretty fascinating because there are quite a number of plays that show up with Shakespeare's names on the title page. And these we now think are Middleton's. So it was, poor Middleton who wrote The Puritan and other plays during this period when he was a junior playwright. And the Yorkshire Tragedy, for instance, looks like it was definitely Middleton's, but it gets published with screaming type that it was William Shakespeare's. So it may be that the junior playwrights weren't getting the commercial value out of their work because the senior playwright, who may have done a little bit with them, was taking all the credit or given all the credit.
Now, an article for Shakespeare Documented mentions that, quote, in 1619, A Yorkshire Tragedy and Sir John Oldcastle Part 1 were attributed to Shakespeare by Thomas Pavier as part of his aborted project to publish a collection of Shakespeare's works, end quote. Eric, who was Thomas Pavier and why did he abandon this project?
Pavier is a Renaissance Elizabethan publisher and who worked on dramatic texts as well as others. And he commissioned William Jaggard, interestingly, in 1619 to what looks to be a collection of Shakespeare's plays that they were going to publish in quarto. And the fascinating thing for us in the 21st century is the first play in this is Henry VI. Henry VI may be the least popular play right now, but that history play was going to be their anchor leadoff. They printed a handful of plays, some of which they had the rights to, some of which they didn't. And for reasons that are a little strange, they falsely dated them. So they were publishing in 1619, and they put some of the dates, they put the date of King Lear as 1608 and things like that. And we're not quite sure why they would have done this, except possibly if there are sort of questions about who owned the licensing and what we would call copyright. They could claim that these were the original things that they had just gathered together. But we know that the signatures on the pages are continuous. They were intending to make this a collection. And the King's Men found out about this, Shakespeare's company. Shakespeare was 3 years dead by this time. And so they went to the Privy Council, the government, and got a cease and desist order saying that you can't print any more plays of the King's Men because they belong to the King's Men. And some of us think that maybe it was at this juncture that they started thinking about, hey, this is a pretty good idea to do a collection of this playwright's work. And what's kind of fascinating is that the printer of these plays, William Jaggard, ended up being the printer and publisher of the leader of the syndicate that published the first folio. So, and the first folio took 2 years to produce. So it's very shortly after 1619 that they start work on the first folio.
Yes. And I mean, speaking of getting credit for things, we consider Hemmings and Condell to be the dear friends that compiled the complete works of Shakespeare in the first folio of 1623. But I always did consider it odd that they waited close to a full decade to publish this memorial collection. But that seeming delay comes into clearer focus when we find out about Thomas Pavier and his experiment in 1619. Were these the only folio editions? I read that there were up to 4 collections of, quote, complete works printed after the bard's death. So why were there so many people clamoring to publish all of Shakespeare's plays under one mantle?
Yeah, it's pretty fascinating because, before the Shakespeare folio, you'd never had a big folio devoted completely to plays. Ben Jonson had a folio, but he included poetry and masques and other things which were more acceptable. So it was a huge financial risk that they took, but it seems to have paid off because the first folio was published in 1623. A second edition came out in 1632, so less than a decade later. And again, these things take 2 years to print. So you had to have made a sufficient profit by that point. What I find kind of interesting is it looks like, as I mentioned before, they're deliberately excluding collaborative work from the folios. But in 1632, when they published the second folio, the same printers bring out a quarto of Pericles and a quarto of the Two Noble Kinsmen within a year or two. And I will bet anything that they were bundling those. That if you buy the complete works of Shakespeare, you will get as a special bonus these 2 collaborative plays that were not included in that. 1664, Philip Chetwynd, the publisher of the third folio, noticed that there were these early quartos from Shakespeare's lifetime that had his name on it. So he put them in. So he put in the third folio, Pericles and the London Prodigal and Thomas Lord Cromwell and the Puritan Widow and the Yorkshire Tragedy and Locrine and Sir John Oldcastle. And none of those plays had been generally accepted into the canon except for Pericles, but they were then reprinted in the fourth folio in 1685. And then in the 18th century, publishers started bringing out octavos, so sets of Shakespeare that in 10 volumes. But most of those apocryphal plays were included in many of the 18th century editions as well.
A listener submitted this next question and wanted to know how many plays Shakespeare would have written in a typical year. Based on the plays we have in the first folio, I estimated about 1 a year. But in context of all of these extant plays that we've got where Shakespeare may or may not have worked on this one over here or that one over there, I want to put the question to you and ask whether the first folio represents the typical play output volume of a lifetime of work for someone like William Shakespeare. And can we tell from that how many plays Shakespeare would have been working on in a typical year as a 16th century playwright?
I think it's probably closer to 2 a year because Shakespeare starts in the theater around the late 1580s. We were not positive. And retires early in 1611 or so, 1612 maybe. So there might be a 22, 23, 24-year career. With the 36 plays we've got in the first folio, and then we add Pericles and the Two Noble Kinsmen, so that takes us up to 38. And then the 10 plays that Jonathan Bate and I selected for the collaborative plays volume, that gets us up close to late 48 plays or so, and that's about 2 a year. And that seems about right because if we look at the publication records, if we look at the performance histories we have, of course, I mean, whenever plague hit London and closed the theaters, Shakespeare didn't write plays, and he went off and wrote narrative poems and then dedicated them to a rich patron so he could make some money during those years. So it's kind of nice that plague hit because we wouldn't have The Rape of Lucrece and Venus and Adonis, if not. But it looks about 2 a year, I think.
I know we would love to learn more about this topic and explore the collaborative plays further. In addition to your book that you've already mentioned, what are your favorite books and resources you would recommend that we go check out to learn more? In
the collaborative plays book that I did mention, there is an absolutely magisterial essay by a young scholar named Will Sharp, who about 100-page essay on authorship and attribution, which is a fantastic summing up of the state of the field and a discussion of each individual play and its pros and cons. I'm in such admiration of Will's work that I want to plug my own volume because of not my contribution, but his. There's a book by Jonathan Hope from Cambridge University Press called The Authorship of Shakespeare's Plays, which is just a delightful title if you think about it. And he does some really interesting discussions of linguistic work and the various kinds of tests that are available to distinguish authors, and some people who only use one form of a word, and some people. I would highly recommend those too. The other thing is authorship attribution studies is a very acrimonious field. I'm not sure if it's the topic itself or the personality of the scholars, but when one wades into it, you suddenly feel that you've entered a bloodbath, because it isn't simply that, no, it's not Thomas Kidd who wrote those, it has to be Shakespeare, and they question your toilet training and things. So it's an interesting field to sort of read around in, if only to get a state of the sort of scholarly discourses going on, which is not above the fray, and it's a very acrimonious field.
Yes, I actually was hesitant about doing an episode on Shakespeare collaborations because I wondered how far into the authorship debate we would have to go. And I feel like you do have to kind of wear your armor when you walk in there, but it is interesting and asks such great questions. It's worth the trip. So
I'm glad. I think so too.
Well, we ask everyone this next question here at That Shakespeare Life, and that's, what's the one book you would take with you on a deserted island? My friends in England tell me I'm supposed to allow you the complete works of Shakespeare and a copy of the Bible, so your choice would be in addition to those. Again,
I don't want to self-promote, but if you're going to have the complete works of Shakespeare, you really need to have the collaborative plays of Shakespeare as well.
Absolutely.
Because that is the way you are going. And there are some people who like to read chronologically through an author's career, and you can't do that if you don't have the early work, the scenes of strong women, or the later collaborative work as he's going into retirement and helping out a fellow playwright. So I think that would be a good pairing.
Well, absolutely, you would be set on a deserted island with both of those. So good choices for sure. Now, what's next for you, though? What are you working on now that you're excited about?
Well, Jonathan Bate and I are, having done an edition of the complete works and then the collaborative plays, are doing a third volume for the Royal Shakespeare Company of the plays of the Shakespeare's company, the plays of the King's Men. And these are plays that his company performed while he was an active member. It doesn't look like he wrote or contributed to them, but he certainly acted in them. And the thing that we lose when we think about isolated authors as the way to read is companies had an organic being. People would go to the King's Men because they had a different kind of play than the Lord Admiral's Men or the Children of the Boys' Chapels. And it's very much today like cable networks, that you go to HBO because they have a certain kind of show. It's not, the genres are different, but there is a certain edginess to HBO, and HBO shows are different than Showtime shows. And I think when we start reading not simply isolated authors, but what was going on in the King's Men, where Shakespeare was the lead author and producing 2 plays a year, but they were also performing another half dozen or more plays a year in addition to that. And I think this will really be revelatory. So I'm very excited to get this out into the world and have people get their responses, how they are now seeing Elizabethan drama differently.
Well, we're looking forward to seeing that when it's published. Thank you so much for telling us about it. If it's anything like the collaborative works, I'm sure it'll be a wonderful read. Eric Rasmussen, thank you so much for being here this week. It has been a delight speaking with you.
Thank you, Cassidy. It's been a real pleasure speaking with you.
To see links to Eric's latest book, as well as to find out how you can connect with him so you can be first in line when his next collection publishes, be sure to visit the show notes for today's episode. I pack extra history into the show notes each week so you can explore this topic further and continue learning about Shakespeare. Find resources, pictures, links, and more at castycash.com/episode 68. That's castycash.com/EP68. That's it for this week here at That Shakespeare Life. I'm Cassidy Cash, that Shakespeare girl, and I hope you learned something new about the Bard. I'll see you next week. Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening to That Shakespeare Life. As always, the best conversations happen after the episode over at CassidyCash.com. Become a part of a vibrant Shakespeare conversation by adding your voice over at the website. Until next time, remember, when you want to know William Shakespeare, you have to go behind the curtain and into That Shakespeare Life.